Here's something overdue. Long overdue. Let's go over the origin and subsequent evolution of the rules of our favorite sport in the world. It's something I've had requested, and honestly, I've wanted to go over it for a while. Besides, how can a channel called BoxingPedia not have an entry covering the genesis of the sport? I hope you enjoy this log. Let's begin. So first off, what is boxing? Like, where'd the term even come from? Is it because of the shape of the ring being a square or a box? If only it were that simple. The origin is unclear, but it leans more so toward the shape of a balled up fist. The Greek word for fist, pix or pixis, means box, as in the shape, like how you put things in a box. Then there's the Middle English meaning of box, which referred to a container, and a punch, like the punch you throw to hit someone with. How it came to mean punch between Old and Middle English remains a mystery. The word box itself comes from boxwood tree, or buxus in Latin. Then there's an origin stemmed in Dutch, German, or Danish. There's the Middle Dutch balk, Middle High German book, and Danish basque. All three words mean a blow, as in a strike or a hit. Perhaps the ambiguity makes it all the more interesting in the long run for us fight fans and historians. Then there's the term pugilism. It's a callback to the sport's ancient origins. The Latin term pugil means a boxer, and is related to the Latin term pugnus, which means fist. That's derived from the Greek term pix, which we discussed earlier, and means fist, or with clenched fist. Finally, there's the term prize fighting. Bit straightforward. It's the pursuit of boxing for the purpose of making money. As for who invented boxing or when it first came about, it isn't far-fetched to believe it's prehistoric. Two lads throwing hands. That's as old as time itself. So easy a caveman can do it. Boxing's earliest record of evidence comes from the 3rd millennium BCE, or BC for those unfamiliar, in the form of Sumerian relief carvings. These were found in modern-day Iraq. Sculptures and the likes continue on coming from such locations as Egypt, Greece, and the Middle East. Even evidence of gloves is depicted, a significance you'll understand a bit down the line. As for an official appearance and practice, boxing's debut was as a formal Olympic event at the 23rd Olympiad in 688 BCE in Greece. Fun fact, the Olympics being so closely tied to boxing is why I find it appropriate to cover amateur boxing in my timelines. Now let's talk rules and regulations. Of course, there were little to none originally. Just take the other guy's head off, and you win. The organization of the sport in Greece brought about some rules. Here's a rundown on screen, short and sweet. There were no rounds, no weight limits, and the matches only ended when a competitor physically could not go on or admitted defeat by holding up a finger. Clinching, defined as holding one's opponent with one or both arms in close quarters, was illegal. The fights were held outdoors in the heat, which added to the challenge. It wasn't uncommon for boxing bouts to leave the combatants disfigured or even dead. Ancient boxers initially covered their hands with oxhide thongs. This changed to leather thongs or sharp thongs. They were made to protect the knuckles but doubled as lacerative weapons. Padded gloves were used only in practice. It's no wonder the Greeks considered boxing to be their most injury-ridden sport. One fundamental thing did come from this era, however, and that was what we know today as the boxer stance. One leg forward and the corresponding lead hand up as a guard. One last thing before we move on from the Greek era. Boxing was a part of pankration, the sect of the Olympiad which featured other combat sports. Here, boxing and wrestling fused, and moves like kicking, holding, choking, and locks on the ground were allowed. Sounds a bit closer to mixed martial arts than anything else. Alright, that covers the 7th century BCE. Jumping to the 4th century BCE over in Rome, boxing managed to be more vicious and barbaric than in Greece. Roman soldiers boxed to practice their hand-to-hand combat. Due to Rome's focus on gladiator combat, which often ended in the death of the loser, boxing would mirror this as citizens thirsted for blood in their entertainment. There was still boxing as a sport, but the gladiator variant reigned supreme. As if the sharp thongs developed by the Greeks weren't enough, the Romans took it further with the cestus. It was a protective leather glove with metal and spikes sewn into it. Talk about killer. However, just as with the Greeks, something fundamental did come from the Roman era of boxing, and that was the boxing ring. It was circular shaped at its inception, but it now existed. The rise of Christianity, the abolition of combat sports in 393 BE, or AD for those who aren't familiar, and the fall of the empire led to the death of pugilism, and it would not see popular resurgence until the latter centuries of the next millennium. This concludes the ancient origin of boxing. Before we jump to the 17th century, we've got to make a stop in the 13th century. Russia popularized its own fist fighting, and it came in 3 forms while sporting many rules depending on the host region of the country. For example, some regions allowed bare knuckles, and others allowed sleeves to be rolled over the hands. Cheating wasn't uncommon in the form of loading sleeves with iron. The one-on-one fight, the team fight, also known as wall-on-wall, and catch drop, which was the least practiced. These were the 3 types. I haven't found any specifics on the catch drop variant, but I'll summarize the other 2. Singles matches had variants of their own. One was like boxing, where you hit and defended at will. Another variant was turn-based, more so like a role-playing game or RPG. Dodging and hitting out of turn were forbidden. Does this sound familiar to you? It sounds like that slapping sport that's growing in popularity today in the 2020s, also in Russia. I digress. Team fights had a bundle of rules to follow and went as follows. The chief fighter acted as the tactician while their walls, or formation of fighters, engaged the opposing walls. The goal was to push the other walls back out of the game area. As you can imagine, wall-on-wall fights doubled as military training. Bare-knuckle fighting still has life today in Russia. Look into it if you're interested. The year is 1681, and we find ourselves in England. The second Duke of Albemarle, Christopher Monk, hosted a fight between his butler and his butcher. Popularity rose, and by 1698, bouts were happening in the Royal London Theatre. Though boxers had fought for rewards and fortune in the past iterations, this rebirth in England is the pinpointing of boxing becoming synonymous with the term prize fighting. Boxers fought for purses and other side stakes, while spectators bet on the outcomes. Welcome to the bare-knuckle era. As far as rules go, there weren't really any. As with the ancient Greek days, no gloves, no weight classes, no real order. Boxers were allowed to wrestle, and it was common to throw opponents down, drop down on them, and hit them while they were down. There were, however, designated rounds for the first time, though not a cap on rounds like today. Bouts went on until a boxer couldn't continue. This disarray of sorts would change soon. In 1719, James Figg became the first English bare-knuckle champion on the back of his popularity. Perhaps he is the very first people's champion? Perhaps. In 1743, one of Figg's pupils and one of the best bare-knuckle fighters ever, Jack Broughton, took the first major step toward legitimizing the sport. The sweet science received its first set of modern rules, which are on screen now, and could actually be called a sport. In fact, this is where the sport was first coined as boxing. It is rumored that Broughton conceived these rules in the aftermath of one of his opponents dying from their injuries, that and a series of other deaths via fistfighting. In fact, he looked to rid the sport of all its barroom brawl blemishes. His introduction of mufflers, ironically enough, led to further brain damage that plagues the sport to this day. When Broughton was beaten in 1750 by Jack Slack, fixed fights rose in prominence and the sport's popularity declined. Amidst this, Daniel Mendoza stood out as an undersized pugilist who used speed to his advantage. Gentleman John Jackson, who beat Mendoza, likewise stood out by introducing the English aristocrats to the sport, which in turn earned respect. The first half of the 1800s would see this respect grow as top-notch British champions came to symbolize honor and masculinity. That about sums up the Broughton Rules era. In 1838, the London prize ring rules were instated by the British Pugilist Protective Association. This ratified many of Broughton's rules, but also introduced its own revisions, of which are on screen now. The 1839 championship bout between James "Deaf" Burke and William Thompson, aka Bendigo, was the first title bout to function under the new rules. The rules were updated in 1853 and are on screen now. Boxing took over England's imagination, most evident in its becoming the country's national sport. Phrases today like "start from scratch" and concepts like a contest ending in a draw or the stakes of a situation stem from this prosperous time period. Boxing would begin gaining momentum across the Atlantic in the United States, especially after the introduction of a new set of rules. These new rules would come about to rid the sport of the brawling that alienated the upper class. You gotta draw money and increase popularity. Why not further organize the sport while you're at it? Enter the Marquess of Queensberry Rules, or just Queensberry Rules. They were drafted in 1865 and released in 1867 by John Graham Chambers of the Amateur Athletic Club. He sought John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, to lend his name for the purpose of legitimacy and overall clout. It would work, ultimately. The rules sought to emphasize skill and technique as the means of victory, as opposed to rule-bending, no-holds-barred brawling. With this would later emerge the sport's title as the Sweet Science. Now, toughness, tactical thinking, and reading one's opponent were the true markings of a pugilist. Hit and don't get hit. It's strategy. It's a chess match. Who can find the balance between aggression and solace? May the best fighter win. There were 4 major rule changes from the London prize ring rules on screen now. Padded gloves were now mandatory. Rounds were 3 minutes and followed by 1 minute of rest. Wrestling was completely illegal, and not answering a 10 count after being knocked down yielded a knockout. Perhaps most notable was the long overdue introduction of weight classes. As with most new things, the rules saw resistance, in particular from the seasoned pros who saw them as unmanly. title bouts remained under the London Prize Ring rules. Young boxers took to the Queensberry Rules, and James "Jim" Mace would serve to increase the popularity of the Queensberry Rules. His impact was apparent because he'd won the English heavyweight title under London Prize Ring rules and still showed preference for Queensberry Rules. As time went on and the old guard retired, London Prize Ring rules faded away and the Queensberry Rules became the norm. The full set of rules are on screen. The rising popularity in the United States also began to show as the sport's best fighters emerged to be Americans. As boxing's popularity dwindled in England due to the evangelical religious revival, the USA took over as its hub. This was aided by the rambunctious nature of boxing, which fit the rising immigrant scene in the United States. Then came a special man, one who would be the bridge to Queensberry Rules for good, and the sport would never look back. John Lawrence Sullivan, an Irish-born American who was the first recognized champion from the States. In a crazy bit of irony, he was firmly against the use of gloves, but wound up being the one who ushered them in for good, perhaps begrudgingly. When gentleman Jim Corbett, who embraced Queensberry Rules in full, defeated Sullivan in 1892, it was set in stone, and the sport truly never looked back. A brief intermission in the form of the American Fair Play rules, which were drafted to address some objections within Queensberry Rules. They're on screen now. The American rules were geared toward amateur boxing, which made them less popular, as Queensberry Rules addressed both amateur and professional ranks. John Boyle O'Reilly and William Edwards penned the American Fair Play rules in 1888. The meteoric rise of John L. Sullivan as the first glove champion and an insanely popular megastar signaled the end of the genesis of modern boxing and the beginning of the Black and White Age, which I consider to have occurred from Sullivan's reign starting in 1888 to the conclusion of the 1950s. It'll receive its own coverage and spread out projects down the line, and I'll have it linked here when it's ready, so check the description or click or tap the bubble in the top right corner. The Saga of Ages, beginning with the up and down 1960s and ongoing today, is available for you to watch right now. The bubble in the top right has just what you need. Rules would continue to be amended, revised, and added past this point under the Queensberry umbrella. Rules like the neutral corner, maximum round limits, how bouts were to be scored, the standing 8 count, the mandatory 8 count, etc. There's other inconsistent rules like the 3 knockdown rule and Saved by the Bell that you can look into if you're interested. Fights generally had unlimited rounds until the 1910s and 20s, where the 15-round championship limit came to be. Still, higher round limits like 20 or so went on a bit after. In 1982, the round limit began to transition from 15 to 12 after the tragic death of Kim Duk-koo. And that's where we stand today on round limits. Mouth guards became mandatory in the 1920s. The neutral corner rule was added around 1927 to ensure knockdown fighters had a fair chance to get back into the fight. Before it, knockdown fighters were stalked by their conquerors and decked again, sometimes before even fully rising. The neutral corner rule has led to so-called long counts becoming more common. Perhaps the most famous case of this comes from the year the rule was introduced and enforced in the Jack Dempsey-Gene Tunney rematch. The match, oddly enough, is still known almost a century later as the Battle of the Long Count. In 1953, the mandatory 8 count was introduced by the New York State Athletic Commission for non-title bouts. The rule requires the referee count to a minimum of 8 seconds for boxers who are knocked down before the bout can resume, even if the knockdown fighter rises before the count of 8. In 1963, the rule was extended to title bouts. In the long run, it has done well to better protect boxers. By the way, don't confuse the mandatory 8 count for the standing 8 count, which allows the referee to start counting whenever they feel a fighter is being overwhelmed. It counts as a knockdown. This rule was also introduced in 1982, after the tragic Mancini-Kim bout, and ultimately dropped in 1998 when it was deemed to give an advantage to the fighter taking the count. Then there's the scoring of bouts. Originally, the referee chose the winner if the bout went the distance. In the early 20th century, the winner was decided by the number of rounds won, again by the referee or a lone judge. Then 2 judges were added to score alongside the referee in order to provide a majority decision. Later in the 20th century, scoring was shifted to 3 judges, and the referee was relegated to directing the in-ring action and the power to take away points via fouls. In 1968, the 10-point must system was introduced by the WBC, which required the winner of a round receive 10 points and the loser 9 or less. Knockdowns typically yield a score less than 9, and if both boxers go down, there may be a score like 9-9 or 9-8. Scoring win types go as follows. Winning all 3 cards yields a unanimous decision. Winning 2 cards and losing 1 card yields a split decision or a majority decision if the 3rd card is a draw. 3 draw cards yield a unanimous draw. 2 draw cards yield a majority draw. And a split draw is reached when one boxer receives card A, the other boxer receives card B, and the 3rd card is a draw. Did you get all that? Good. Other scoring systems include the 5-point must system, 1-point must system, and the mentioned round system. Boxing matches today follow the unified boxing rules from the Association of Boxing Commissions, on screen now. And that'll do it for the origin of boxing, everyone. The mystery surrounding boxing actually makes it even more interesting, at least in my opinion. Seeing the sport evolve into what it is today has been refreshing. This has been the Charles Jackson, author of the Boxing Encyclopedia. See you in my next log. Thank you.